Okay, I'm recording.
Okay, so do you want me to start?
Yeah, look, thanks everyone. There are still some people joining, but we'll get started. Thank you very much, Catherine, for giving up your time to contribute to our maths PLP. It's pretty exciting for us to have so many people online, so I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, Lorraine and Derek. What I plan to do today, I've got a lecture organised, and I just want to say up front, it's a lecture on technology, and it's really hard to have an interactive lecture, obviously on Zoom with so many people, but I'll do my best to keep you engaged. It would be good if you have questions or comments as I talk, to use the chat function, and you should be able to see on your screens a reactions function as well. So, and that gives you the option of a thumbs up and a clap. So if you think I'm funny and my jokes are good, a thumbs up or a clap would be appreciated, or just, if you like what I say. So I'm going to base today's lecture on a lot of research that I've conducted over the years, but also on a more recent research from a book that I've just written with my co-author, Kath Holmes, on technology-enabled mathematics education. The exciting thing about this book is that we came up with a theoretical model, and I've actually got a live three-dimensional one here called the Technology Integration Pyramid. And what I'll be doing this morning is walking you through this model and giving you examples of technology use in mathematics education from early years all the way to senior secondary. So yeah, any comments would be great on chat, because I'd like to kind of gauge your reactions. And if we have time at the end, perhaps I might be able to answer some questions that you could pose on chat as well. So what I'll do is I will share my screen now to get the PowerPoint. And I'm sorry, it's going to be death by PowerPoint a little bit, but hopefully it will be engaging enough for you. Okay, so it's a very busy PowerPoint page just there, but I wanted to show off my pyramid. So there it is. Okay, now over the next hour, this is what I'm going to be talking to you about. That should say why mathematics and technology, not what mathematics and technology. The 4 considerations for technology use, which comes from the pyramid. So mathematics, tools, pedagogy and engagement, and the influences on technology use. So why maths and technology? Independently of each other, maths and technology in Australian schools are often cited as reasons for concern. International and national mathematics test results indicate a decline in student outcomes and has resulted in fewer students choosing advanced mathematics in the senior years of secondary schooling. Now, this has implications for the career and study options that students have beyond school. Regardless of test results, maths gets a bad rap. How many times have you heard adults say, "I'm just not a maths person"? It's a common perception that some people are good at maths and some are not, and that seems to be acceptable, unfortunately. One of the reasons for these downward trends in participation, achievement, and attitudes towards maths has been identified as a lack of engagement with mathematics, which often emerges during the middle years of schooling. Digital technology can redefine learning and teaching of maths for contemporary students, improving engagement and ultimately participation in mathematics. But technology used in schools is not without its critics and not without challenges. How many of us are guilty of checking our phones constantly and distracted from our work or our family? Similarly, technology can be a distraction for both students and teachers. Prior to COVID-19, some schools had implemented a ban on technology as a selling point to appeal to parents who were concerned over screen time in student learning. That's probably changed in recent times. This type of binary argument is common in education, but we could argue that our response to technology use must be far more balanced. We can't ignore digital technologies that are part of our everyday lives. And I think COVID-19 has actually proven that. If we exclude technology use from schools, we're not preparing students for a world that is technology infused, nor are we promoting connections between learning at school and the outside world. So why use technology in maths education? I want you to take a moment and think about why you would use technology if, in your future classroom teaching, or even on your prac visits. Why would you use technology? What reasons would you have? Now, this is a quote from a student from my most recent study. And I think it's quite a telling quote. Just with the technology, I feel like maths is one of those things that is just a bit behind. So when you compare the use of technology in maths classrooms to other subjects, it's always very, very different. Teachers in secondary tend to flick back to the textbook as the main resource rather than technology use. And the students actually notice that, unless they've got a very, technology, I guess, proficient teacher who really loves the use of technology. And I'll show you some of those examples in a minute. Now, Mark Scott is he's the Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Education. So it's one of the biggest, well, it is the biggest Department of Education in the world because of the number of schools. And what he said recently, it was in January 26, 2020, so before the COVID shutdowns, too much attention can be paid to devices and not enough to the way we are using devices for teaching and learning. And he said, I don't think the answer is to deny students access to technology. This is all really interesting considering what's happened in recent weeks and the fact that technology now is the main resource for teaching and learning. I'm not sure where you are in Western Australia in terms of whether your schools are back or teaching online. Lorraine, can you tell me?
Schools are back, but some schools are still teaching online, so it's a bit of a blended approach at the moment.
I think the current issue with COVID is really going to change the way that we deliver education into the future, even face-to-face education, because we've forced all of these teachers who were very resistant to teaching with technology, and not everybody is resistant, but a large group of teachers are resistant or were resistant, and now they've had experience having to teach through technology. So it'll be really interesting to see how this actually works out in the future and what the impact is. So what do we need to know when we're teaching with technology? Just because we can use a mobile phone and just because we can teach doesn't mean we can actually merge the two together very successfully. So there are some frameworks that are out there that describe the type of knowledge that teachers need to have to teach with technology. And a very well-known framework, which some of you may have heard of, is the TPAC framework by Kohler and Mishra. And so what that does is it combines the knowledge for teaching that we usually have. So pedagogical content knowledge of content, knowledge of how children learn that content, and knowledge of how to teach it. And it combines that with knowledge of how to use devices to teach that content. In terms of mathematics, there are different things we need to consider. So we have to think about how we conceive the use of technology in mathematics classrooms. How do we imagine that we can use it to enhance the use of technology? We also have to think about classroom management. So a lot of things come into consideration here when we talk about classroom management and technology. It's what pedagogies are we going to use? Are we going to have students one-to-one on a device, or are they sharing devices? What devices do we have? All of those sorts of things. Part of that classroom management is also how do we consider student engagement? Now, depth and breadth of content is really interesting when we talk about TPAC and knowledge for teaching with technology, because often when we use technology in classrooms, what we plan to teach can go in lots of different directions because of the affordances of that technology. So for example, if you're doing some really nice maths investigations, and it doesn't matter what level you're working with, whether it's early childhood or senior secondary, often students can go off in different directions, and we have to be prepared mathematically to be able to cope with that. So understanding where the maths could go when it's more open-ended is really, really important. We also need to make sure that we know how to teach with technology well. So, you know, how do we use the technology to make sure that we're able to present content in a way that's comprehensible to the students in front of us, or the students at the end of the, you know, in a house somewhere locked up because of COVID-19. Now, one of the issues that we're constantly faced with in education is new, like emerging technologies. We haven't had any seriously new technologies in the last few years. I mean, the latest biggest thing was the iPad and tablets. But prior to that, it was interactive whiteboards. So a lot of you, well, I don't know if any of you can think about the newest thing, I guess, using different tools that give you different opportunities to see mathematics, and different representations of mathematics are being introduced. Like those, what do they call those goggles where we, I've lost my words. The you know, being able to go into 3 dimensions with mathematics is really important.
VR goggles.
Yes, virtual reality. They're becoming quite popular in schools that can afford. But you can imagine what the opportunities are for mathematics in virtual reality, being able to explore different dimensions and different things. But anyway, so my point is, we might have knowledge on how to use technology really well with what we have now, but every time something new comes in, and it might be new software, not necessarily hardware, what happens when we introduce new technologies? Now, these are some interesting quotes from the past, because every time a new technology has come into education, whether it's digital or not, people tend to panic. So if you take a moment to read these quotes, they're quite entertaining, but it is pretty representative of how we feel when we get new things. So that is around paper. So students today depend too much on ink. 1907 and 1929, store-bought ink. It's interesting, 1950 wasn't that long ago, but we've had so many developments in technology since then. Now, this is a really nice diagram that really looks at that TPAC model, which is the ultimate goal, and taking what we know about teaching, the pedagogical content knowledge, and what happens when we introduce something new. Now, I really like this, and this is really good for people who are just at the beginning of their careers as teachers, you know, looking at a technology and thinking, how does this fit in with what I'm going to teach and how I'm going to teach? So, for example, you walk into a classroom and you might be going on a prac or something, and the teacher might have some kind of a device that you've never thought of using with teaching. And so the first step in developing your TPAC, your technological and pedagogical content knowledge, is recognizing that I might be able to use this tool in my teaching. So I recognize that it might be helpful. The next step is accepting. So, okay, I'm going to have a go, and then adapting something. So you might plan to teach in a particular way, and now you're going to adapt that plan to include that technology. And the exploring phase is about playing around with it. And the thing is, it's good to be fearless, I guess, when exploring with technology. Nobody's going to get hurt if it doesn't work, unless it's virtual reality, which is a bit dangerous for kids sometimes. But play around with things. That's the only way you're going to learn, you know, how to take advantage of technology. And then advancing is, you know, really focusing on making sure that there's excellence in what you're doing with that technology. So that's a nice diagram that explains to teachers that, you know, there's a process. You don't go from the left-hand side, from pedagogical content knowledge, automatically to TPAC. There's some learning that has to happen. And sometimes that becomes a cycle. So you don't have to get it right the very first time. Someone has to mute their microphone. Thank you. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is talk about the pyramid that I showed you, and side by side. So these, the sides of the pyramid are interrelated. It's very hard sometimes to separate the mathematics from the pedagogy, from the engagement, and from the tools. Okay, so know that they're not. This is why we came up with a three-dimensional model, because all the sides depend on each other, if that makes sense. So first I'm going to talk about the mathematics. Now, before you use any technology, what you need to do is think about two things: the affordances of that technology or that piece of software, and the constraints. So how does it help you teach the mathematics? And on the other hand, how does it constrain you? So an example that I use quite often is, all right, if I'm going to use an app, and it's an app that explores three-dimensional objects, is that going to help me, or is that going to constrain me? So if I was in an early years classroom and I wanted to use an app about three-dimensional objects, I would actually prefer that my students could pick up the objects and play with them and roll them around and stack them and do all of that. You can't do that with an app. But if the app, for example, can be used alongside those materials, so it might be used, or you might be able to use your device to take photographs of stacking the objects. So you're not actually using it for the mathematics, you're using it alongside the mathematics, then that's an affordance that could work for you. Or in primary, for example, or lower secondary, if the app actually shows objects unfolding into nets, then that's actually an affordance. Because you can't take, you know, a solid object in your hand and open it up into a net. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope it does. I know you can't all answer me, but maybe you can show me some thumbs up. I don't know if I can see thumbs up because I've got so many faces. Yay, okay, there's a few, excellent, okay. All right, so the idea of affordances and constraints is really important, because just because you have technology, it doesn't mean you have to use it. I always say to teachers and pre-service teachers that if it's not going to make what you are going to do better for you, like for your teaching or for the students' learning, then don't feel compelled to use it. It's better that you don't use it, okay? Because it can become a distraction. All right, now this is a quote that I use quite often because I love it. There's a book by Howard Gardner, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the theory of multiple intelligences. That was very, very popular about 20 years ago, I think. But he wrote a book in 2013, which is now 7 years old. Time flies, I think, when you're having fun. But he talks about apps and the use of apps. So any software is regarded as an app. Apps can make you lazy, discourage the development of new skills, limit you to mimicry or tiny trivial tweaks or tweets, or they can open up whole new worlds. So he talks about being app-enabled or app-dependent. Now, if you take a second to think about how you use your devices, your personal devices, like a mobile phone or a GPS or whatever, think about whether you're app-enabled or app-dependent. So app-enabled means that you're using these apps to make your life a little bit easier, and you're using the time that you save to do better things. So in a maths classroom, you might use the time that you save to calculate by, you know, engaging in problem solving and critical thinking, rather than just depending on that app and then not doing anything better with the rest of your time. I hope that makes sense. So app-enabled or app-dependent is really important. And another way of thinking about how you use technology, will you make your students app-dependent or app-enabled? Now, there you go. We've got lots and lots of options in terms of mathematics and technology. Look, some of these are great, some not so great. I won't give you my personal opinion on all of these, but I do have one. So that might be a topic for another day. But, you know, when you're a teacher, you're faced with a whole lot of different software applications, and all, you know, trying to be the best and the most popular. A lot of them are subscription based. So you have to be, you think very, very carefully about whether, if you're, you know, one day in a position to actually make that decision in a school, whether it's quality or not, and whether you can do without it. Because just because something's subscription based, it doesn't mean it's good. Always think about best practice in teaching mathematics and what's best for your students. And some of these on this screen don't represent best practice, don't represent the development, or that don't encourage the development of understanding, conceptual understanding. Often mathematics-based apps and software programs are just really good for building fluency and nothing else. So you've got to think really carefully. They also trap you into using technology in just one way, whereas technology has a lot of affordances. One thing I want you to think about when you're using technology is the proficiencies. So I just mentioned fluency, and so something like mathletics, for example, might build fluency if there's understanding underpinning it. So always have the proficiencies in the back of your mind when you're using technology. How are these technologies, or how are these apps promoting understanding of concepts, fluency, and not just fluency in computation, which a lot of apps do, but fluency in problem solving? How do they promote problem solving? Often they don't. They say they do, but it's not real problem solving. And how do they provide opportunities for students to reason? And that's one of the big critiques I have of a lot of math software, is that they don't promote opportunities for reasoning. So those are the things to have on a mental checklist. I'm just going to show you some snapshots now of activities where, you know, there might be maths embedded, but they're not typical maths apps. So for example, I've been showing this one for a few years. Some of you might remember Temple Run. It was very popular a few years ago. Now I got addicted to Temple Run when it was popular, but I saw an opportunity for some mathematics to come from Temple Run, not based in Temple Run. So it's a free game. And if you were familiar with it, and it might have changed its interface over the years, but this is a screenshot from when I was good at it. The score page, for example, has some really interesting mathematics, and you can use this as a stimulus for mathematics learning. What you need to do is make sure the focus is on the mathematics, not so much on the technology. So for example, here, I might hook my students in by playing the game, but the game is over very, very quickly. And so what you've got is something to play with. So for example, I could talk about the score here and ask, well, first of all, we don't use a comma when we're writing numerals. Now, why is there a comma there, and why don't we use it anymore? If you could read that score, what would you say? So, for example, if a student can't read that as 385,917, then I might pick up that there's an issue with place value understanding. Also, we could talk about the distance. What does that mean? Why is it in meters? Is there a better unit that we could express that in? And then there's a shop where you can buy things. So what can I buy with my coin? So little things like that. Now the next screen has some of my ideas around, you know, the sorts of tasks that could be used alongside that game. So it's using technology, but in a different way. These are just my thoughts, and they do come out of my head that quickly. But you could go from closed short tasks that would engage students at the start of a lesson, or you could go to more complex investigations. So if you have a look at this one here, whoops, sorry, I'll go back. Convert your total distance to kilometres or centimetres. Investigate how many times you would need to run around the perimeter of the school playground if you had to run the distance of your group's total or the class total. How did you work this out? So now I know I've used technology to actually start off a lesson, but my focus now is on mathematical investigation. So here's another tool that it's called SketchUp. It's free. It's a tool where you design things in 3 dimensions. It's used by a lot of interior designers and architects, but primary and secondary students could definitely use this, and I've used it in teaching. And it's a really nice way of using technology. And if you use this to, give them a design task or something like that, and then embed it with really good reflection prompts and open-ended questions, then you've got a really good task. So that's another different way of using that technology. Now, if you've got tablets, teachers tend to go crazy. Well, they did when iPads came out. They went crazy around having apps for this and apps for that. Think about tasks that combine different affordances of apps. So this is one called Angle Treasure Hunt, where, imagine you've got some iPads or tablets that, allow you to go outside the classroom and see mathematics in the real world. And it's using a combination of the camera, a photo, and explain everything. And so what's important here is not the actual technology, but what it allows you to do. So you would ask students to take photographs of angles in the environment. What they can do with Explain Everything is actually draw over the angles and draw them and label them. And they can actually respond to these questions verbally and record their voices. So you're using a multimedia approach to mathematics, which is not your typical maths task. But what it does is it makes a connection with mathematics outside the classroom and the mathematics inside the classroom. And that's really making a really good use of the affordance of mobile technologies such as iPads or cameras. Here's an example of a task, and this one's featured in the book that I've just had published. One of the teachers in the book did this task. Now, she had spheros, so robotics is another good, that's probably the latest, I guess, when I was talking about new technologies. Robotics has really come to life in schools, in recent years, with affordable robotics such as spheros and little B-bots and probots and things like that. Now, this was a really great task. So it involved the students choosing to visit a coffee shop or something in their local area, and then drawing a scaled map from school to that venue, and then programming the Sphero to actually drive along that map as if it was a driverless car. Now, here's a word of warning. This was a really good idea, but the teacher thought that the kids could actually do this task in one lesson. She underestimated the amount of mathematics involved in this lesson. So this is the type of lesson that really could have spanned for a whole week. And I think it did span for a whole week in the end. But what it was nice about it was that it was individualized because students had choice. So in terms of engagement, it was a really good task. It used a combination of technologies. So the Sphero, so there was coding involved. So there's mathematics in that as well. It used mobile technologies. I mean, the kids had to go onto Google Earth. There were a whole lot of different elements of technology going into this one task. And if you had to sit down and write out all the mathematics that was required, it's a very, very rich but very complex task that probably needed to be broken down a little bit more into individual lessons. But there you go. That's a teacher who's very comfortable with technology. I wouldn't expect every single teacher to be able to do this unless they actually knew it inside out. Okay, some other examples where you can find mathematics. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen Gapminder, and I'm going to try and see if my technology will work and take you into this website. Lorraine, if you can tell me whether you can see it on your screen once I get into the website, because I might have to change my screen share. Okay, I suspect you can't see it.
No.
Okay, all right, that's okay. Give me a second. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second, and because I really want you to see this, and then share my screen again. Okay. All right, now can you see Gapminder?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right, now, look, I thoroughly recommend this to all teachers, not just secondary, primary, and perhaps even early years, because what you can do is actually show this on the screen and talk about it, and not just for maths. This is really cool. So the first thing I want to show you is Dollar Street. So if you go into Dollar Street, this is really, really beautiful. So you can compare lots of things about different families across the world. Now, let's have a look. So this is just families in the world by income. What you can change around here. This is really beautiful for wicked homes. So most loved items. How about that? Let's have a look at that. Okay. Isn't this interesting? The most loved items. Now, imagine if you use this just as a stimulus for some data collection in a primary classroom. Now, what's your most loved item, and what's the most common most loved item? And are there differences across the world? Like, look at Cambodia. Obviously, that's a tailor. And there was a sewing machine somewhere. Where is it? Nigeria. Interesting. So little things like that. You can play around with this. You can look at specific countries. Let's have a look. What about, pets or teeth? Let's go pets. Teeth is a bit gruesome. But can you indicate using your reactions whether you think this is interesting and something that kids would love? A thumbs up, or I can't see any. Oh, yes, we've got a few people. I love the cat in Romania. So anyway, so Dollar Street. So if you look at Gapminder, just take note, gapminder.org. That's something that's really, really awesome. And there's a lot of little elements in Gapminder that are worth looking at, particularly for, these tools are fantastic as well. Let me just click into this. So this is a nice way of using technology. And what it does, which is really powerful, is it makes it relevant, makes the maths relevant. This is about people in the real world. So I imagine that at some point there'll be some really nice graphs around COVID-19 here when it's all over and when we're feeling a bit more positive about it. Okay, now I'm going to stop share for a second because there's a link, another link in my PowerPoint that I want to show you. But I've got to do this complex swapping. All right. So here's another one. Actually, I won't share it. What I'll do is I'll just explain what it is. But this is something that it was just in the news, ABC News. And what it is, it's a little link to something around comparing your income. Actually, I will show you because it's so cool. But I'm going to change the share again. Isn't it good that technology is working? Okay. Lorraine, can you tell me if you can see something that says, how does your income compare to everyone else's?
No, I can just see a black screen with a white line across it.
Okay, all right, let me try again. This should work this time. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. So now this one's probably, I mean, it's really a secondary one, and what you'd need to do is make it hypothetical in terms of, because what it does, it asks you for some questions. So where do you think your income sits on the scale of lowest to highest earning Australians? So I've got to say, okay, so I would say, this is just hypothetical, right? I'm not going to use my income. It might be dropping soon anyway if universities get their way. Then you talk about what's your weekly take-home pay. So let's, what would be an average take-home pay for a teacher, first year out teacher, Lorraine? What do you think? We go 800. I don't know if that's anywhere near correct. But say, imagine you got $800 a week take home, then this is where you would sit. Now, there's a whole lot of other things here, interactive things around people in income brackets, and then you can compare to people in your postcode. So let's go, this is a Western Australian one. And what it does, it tells you where you sit in comparison to other people in your state, in your postcode, etc. So there's some really interesting things online that are not necessarily aimed at education. So not aimed at teachers, but you can actually use them to teach mathematics, whether they form part of the lesson body or whether they're just the stimulus to get kids thinking about the mathematics that you want to teach in the lesson. Okay, my mouse has died. Whoop, now it's connected. Okay. All right. So just moving around the pyramid now to the tools. Now, it's really important that you understand what you have at hand to use in terms of the affordances. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes that I found on probably Twitter or something. And some of you may have been working in schools that have computer labs, and it's really interesting in light of this quote, how many pencil labs do you have in your school? So should computers be, just confined to a lab, or should they be something that's at hand all the time? Can I just do a little poll here, and can you put your hand up or thumbs up if you think that technology should be, within reach in a classroom? So just thumbs up if you think that it should be an integral part of a classroom. I'm just looking at all the thumbs up. Okay, excellent. All right, thank you for those people who put their thumbs up and are listening. All right, now the next screen is just a photo of one of the classrooms from my book, because what the book actually, I should have said this at the beginning, has 10 case studies from early childhood all the way to senior secondary, including a special needs classroom. And this is one of the teachers who featured, and she was a year 3 teacher, and she ran this wonderful lesson. Now, what was wonderful was that she wanted it to be interactive. She wanted it to have technology in it, but she didn't have enough devices in terms of robotics. So you could see the B-bots there in the background on the floor. She didn't have enough B-bots for every single group of students. So what she did was she used their iPads, because the kids had a BYOD program, Bring Your Own Device, which means every child had an iPad. And she used the B-bot app. And so the children who didn't have a B-bot actually got to use the app, and she replicated the task so it was exactly the same. So some students used the app and manipulated the B-bot through the app, and some actually had the physical B-bots. Now, what's really nice about that photograph is the body language, because you could see that those kids were really highly engaged in the task. I don't think there was anybody. There's one little girl with her back against the bookshelf there who is, looking away, but I don't think that's a sign of disengagement. It was a really, really lovely task that's described in full in the book. Now, moving to the other end, this is a teacher who is a senior secondary teacher, and the way that he used the tools at hand was that he used a learning management system. So, where we have Blackboard in universities, some teachers use learning management systems like Canvas. This particular teacher used OneNote, which is really, really good. And what he did was he had all of his teaching resources housed in OneNote. So it was like a repository. But he also, it was kind of alive, because what he would do was embed different videos. He might scan a bit of textbook, for practice, that type of thing. But you can see on this slide here, where he's got this video, he's got his little face in the corner. So video in terms of teaching and learning has had a great boom, obviously, because of the online distance learning that's happened in the last few weeks. But what's nice about this is that his face is there, so it's personalized, rather than having somebody else's face or a video created by somebody else. He's created his own videos. They look a bit homemade, but that's kind of nice, and the kids really appreciated that. But another nice thing that he did was that when the kids submitted their work through OneNote, so it was all digital, he would give them feedback, and instead of pen and paper feedback or pen and tablet feedback, he would actually record a quick video, which was quicker for him to do than actually handwrite feedback, and make it individualized and personalized. So he used the tools in really nice creative ways to enhance his students' experiences of mathematics. Now, this is a comment from one of his students. Now, the beauty of using a learning management system, as this student says, is that it's very organised. But more importantly, what it allows the students to do is to have access to past lessons and access to future lessons. And that's really, really important, because if a student wants to revise something, particularly in upper secondary, everything's there. All the videos are there, all the written comments, all the verbal comments are there. And then if they want to move forward, they've already got the lessons planned out. This particular teacher also designed his lesson so that there wasn't a linear learning path. So some students, not all students follow the same path depending on their needs. So he was able to differentiate the tasks through OneNote, which is really, really powerful. And he wasn't the only secondary teacher to do that. And just a word of warning as well, that, you know, setting up your classroom like that takes a lot of work. And so it's only for the really committed teachers, but it's not impossible. You know, the setup work is really a lot, but once you've got it set up, then it's more of a maintenance issue than anything else. This is a comment about the videos that I spoke about. So he makes a personalised video for you. And, you know, senior secondary students really, really appreciated this use of the affordance of technology. A couple of other quotes. You know, kids like YouTube, but you've got to be really careful about YouTube and make sure that it actually is good practice and it is good mathematics, because if the mathematics is not right, then, you know, students can develop misconceptions. And this comment here, the bottom comment, is about how Echo, which is a learning management system, really helps them. Okay, so some dot points to summarise what I've just said about the mathematics, thinking about whether your content is taught in isolation or connected, whether you're looking at process or content, so problem solving versus fluency, whether you're able to show dynamic representations and whether you're just using that for computation, and then the tools. So thinking about whether the school that you're in has a bring your own device program, or if you have to share tools, then you've got to, you know, design your teaching around sharing those devices. And things like connectivity are really important, and, you know, the ability to download software in a school, because it's not always that simple. So we're on to the third side of the pyramid, and that's pedagogy. So this is really exciting, the pedagogy part. Some of you may be familiar with the SAMR framework: substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. Basically, it's a description of the type of practices you use with technology. So at the, you know, the bottom level, substitution, it makes no difference whether you use the technology or not. It's not making anything better. Augmentation, slightly different. Modification means you're really changing the task because of the technology. And redefinition is when you're designing tasks that were previously inconceivable without that technology. So it's a way of just describing how you're using the technology. And, you know, sometimes substitution is okay. But our ultimate goal would be to redefine learning if we're going to be spending all that money on the technology. A way of thinking about SAMR also is thinking about how you want your students to be using that technology. Do you want them to consume, or do you want them to produce? So consuming would be just playing with an app that's a maths game, and, you know, they're just consuming, they're not doing anything else. But at the other end, they might be using something like Explain Everything, where they're actually creating, and that's very, very powerful in terms of promoting the proficiencies, and also promoting student engagement. And then what kind of thinking are we asking our students to do? Again, substitution is really just the lowest level if you think about Bloom's taxonomy, whereas redefining it is the highest level. Okay, now we've seen that one. I'm just going to go through these quickly, and I'm watching the time, so I don't want to run out of time. Same teacher that had the Sphero before, a different type of task, where she's trying to combine technologies, but also trying to combine mathematics. So the ultimate goal of this lesson was recognizing number patterns, but there was a lot of other mathematics in it as well. Now this is being recorded, so I think you'll have access to be able to go back to visit these tasks at a later date. Using things like Kahoot is really great, or getting kids to design their own Kahoot tasks. I'm sure some of you would have heard of Kahoot by now, but it's a really nice way to do a little bit of assessment at the end of a lesson as well. You could see the body language of these kids, they're right into it. They were very highly engaged. Using things like Padlet. Padlet's really nice because it captures data in real time and allows you to move the flow of a lesson if children are not understanding, or you look at you find misconceptions in the responses that are coming up on the Padlet. You can actually change the flow of the lesson immediately. So Padlet, you might have seen it already, is like a pin board, but it's really, really great if you've got kids with devices in their hands. So in terms of pedagogy, these are the considerations. You know, whether you're taking a social constructivist approach or a behaviorist, whether you want student-centered or teacher-centered learning, whether you want to use a technology just for teaching or for both teaching and learning, because sometimes it just helps you demonstrate stuff as a teacher, how you want your students using it, whether you want to differentiate tasks, how you use it for assessment, how you group your students, how many devices you use, and whether you're flipping learning. So whether you're asking them to do something outside the classroom before they come into the classroom. And engagement. Finally, we've got to engagement, my favourite thing. Okay, so what is engagement? It's multidimensional. So if we think about engagement, it's not just being on task, it's being in task. We want our students to be cognitively engaged, so thinking really hard about the mathematics. We want them to be operatively engaged, so we want active participation. And we want them to genuinely value it. We want them to like mathematics. We want them to understand the value of mathematics. Now, when those three things come together, just like that, that's when we have substantive engagement. So kids who are working hard, thinking hard, and feeling good about mathematics. So how can technology do that? This is from my framework for engagement with mathematics, but basically the foundation of engagement is the development of positive pedagogical relationships. So knowing your learners as learners of mathematics, not just as, you know, on a social level, understanding what they need, and often you can use technology to build pedagogical relationships. And then the engaging pedagogies. Now you can see student-centered technologies listed here, but you could actually have technology in the whole background there, because technology can be used to promote all of these elements. I'm sorry, I'm rushing a bit, but I'm frightened I won't get to the end. Just a couple of pictures. That's a close-up of the VBOT lesson. And this lesson on the right is from the classroom of the teacher that had the spheros. But what you see there is some kids with iPads in their hands, but they're also using whiteboards. They're also using, on the floor, they've got those little magnetic whiteboards. So what I want to point out with those photos is that the focus of those lessons was on the mathematics, not the technology, and that's really critical. It's not a very subtle difference, it's a huge difference. The kids are actually looking at, you know, the number pattern that they've built, they're talking, they're not just playing with the devices, and that's what you have to aim for when using technology. I talked about the constructive feedback in the videos. That's that teacher again, Joel, who was amazing in terms of, you know, being senior secondary, and he was just magic. Some comments from kids from an earlier study around using iPads and how it engaged them. It's great that they can make mistakes and feel okay to make those mistakes because the technology wipes it away. Having said that, though, sometimes we need those students' mistakes to be able to pick up misconceptions and to teach from those mistakes. And there are negatives to everything. Like sometimes kids can hide in technology. They can, you know, pretend they're actually engaged in a task, but not actually be engaging with it in the right way. So you've got to be really careful. Okay, so we've got the four sides of the pyramid here. We've got our engagement, pedagogy, tools, and mathematics, but there are influences on all of those things. And this is where this particular model comes to life, because no other models like TPAC or SAMR actually consider the environment, so culture, commitment, context, and community. Those things impact how technology plays out in each and every single classroom. Every classroom is unique and every school is unique. So there's no recipe for, you know, perfect technology use. It's about how you use what you've got access to and what your students have access to, and the abilities around that, and how you use that to the best advantage. So I think that's important to consider. And, you know, here's some dot points around those 4 elements. The book, I don't know, Lorraine, your library might be able to get the book because it's an ebook as well, and it would be useful for students to have a look at some of these things and some of the case studies.
I'll get onto it.
Yeah. For some, you know, there's a chapter on, you know, a preschool class or early childhood class that, you know, the early years teachers might be interested in, and there's chapters on the senior secondary, etc. So the lessons that I've talked about are explained in detail there. All right, so those are the things that really influence, and some of those elements here. This is that table, but in a different format. Some of those things we have control over as teachers, and some we don't. So this diagram is something that tries to detail that. You know, there are some things in terms of culture, for example, that we have some control. So teachers, for example, have a lot of control around classroom culture, as school leaders do. Likewise with community, we don't have a lot, school leaders do, because they often have a lot of interaction with community, but teachers not as much. So there are some things that we can influence and some things we can't. In terms of commitment, for example, we have a lot of influence on commitment in our own classroom, but also we have influence on those around us. You know, if we share our good practice, then more people are likely to engage in that practice, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's the pyramid. Ta-da! It would be good to have some applause here because, you know, it's beautiful. Yay, thank you. Anyway, look, I'm very proud of this pyramid, and in reality, if we take away the mathematics side, we could put in any discipline area and the pyramid would work, and we're actually testing it at the moment in a couple of projects. That's the book, and we've got about 7 minutes after I read through this last slide, or 5 minutes for any burning questions. So basically, this summarizes what I've said. So effective use of technology has purpose, focuses on processes and content. So the content of the curriculum plus the proficiencies. It provides opportunities for students to be assessed. That moves away from the traditional pen and paper maths test. It provides opportunity for constructive feedback, promotes engagement, promotes collaboration, and enhances the learning and teaching of mathematics. Now, here's a final thought before I open up for questions.
Emma. 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 Emma.
Nouveau le trèfle maxifin, vraiment plus large.
So, I mean, that was, I don't know if you were able to see that in real time, because sometimes there's a lag with videos. But yeah, that's even more important and more relevant because of the toilet paper, I think, after, you know, what's happened in Australia. There are my contact details. I have a blog site, which looks a little bit different to that because I've changed it. It's engagingmaths.com, and a lot of what I've talked about is embedded in that blog site somewhere, but we've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I don't know if we can if we can pose any questions or, oh, sorry, someone said, can I go back to the slide of the pyramid dot points? Yes, I can do that. Just give me a moment. Sorry. Okay, share screen. I've just got to share screen again and go backwards. But if there's any burning questions, please. Okay, I think it's this. No, it's not that one. It's this one. So maybe take a screenshot of that, the person who wanted that. Okay, that should give you enough time for a screenshot. And all right, so are there any, if we could have your recommendations on which maths apps are best to use in primary school, that would be amazing. Well, that's a really good question, but there are tens of thousands of apps. On my website, there's a document that I wrote a few years ago now that has over 100 apps that I've critiqued and ranked and all of that. But you might be able to use the criteria I've used in that document. It's in the free resources section of my website. You might be able to use that to, I guess, analyze the effectiveness of apps that you're thinking of using. It's very tricky to keep up because there are so many apps available. Okay. Any other? I like that comment that someone's definitely map dependent rather than app dependent because of GPSs. I can too. Any other questions or comments?
Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
How are you going?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for this. I just thought I'd ask, in the very early years in kindergarten and pre-primary, when the learning is so hands-on and we're building that conceptual, those very foundational conceptual understandings, what kind of technology would you want to see? Would you see being beneficial in the early years, or do you think that perhaps when children are 4 or 5, there might not be as much room for it?
Look, I think because technology is such a part of kids' lives, I mean, everywhere you go, you see kids in prams with iPhones in their hands, you know, being used as babysitters, etc. So it's part of their lives. So I think it's about how you use it and how much in the early years, because, you know, there are issues to consider around fine motor skills as well and being dependent on using screens. But if you think about, you know, an affordance of technology that's really good for early childhood is the ability to capture kids' thoughts, like by recording their what they say, because they can't write.
Yeah, totally.
Imagine in an early years classroom, you can get really good insight into their mathematical thinking by getting them to do something on Explain Everything, rather than being, you know, having to wait around for them to write something that's, you know, takes forever.
Yeah.
Or getting them to photograph things. So you wouldn't necessarily be using apps and games, but you might be using the other affordances to give you better insight and enable you to help them. An example in the book was we went into a preschool classroom, so 3 and 4 year olds who were using this new app that Professor Tom Lowry is developing. And it's an early years app, and what it does, it gets them to go outside and record things, and it's based on spatial reasoning. And so they're recording things and talking about them and making little videos. Yeah. And it's just fantastic, like what these little kids can do.
Amazing. What was that called again? Sorry.
I don't know if the app is freely available. It's part of the ELSA project, ELSA. So you could probably, and it's Professor Tom Lowry. So I don't know if the apps are openly available yet. It was a federally funded research project, but we went into the classroom of one of the teachers in the project, and we saw what she was doing with the apps, and it was great. I mean, if you can get a good app, that kind of complements what you're teaching and fits perfectly, because sometimes apps go off in different directions. They're not often designed by educators, and that's a real problem. But it could be that you might use that type of app to practice skills that you've covered already.
Yeah.
But just got to be careful, because you've got to make sure that classroom management aspect is really important. You know, that kids are actually on task and doing what they're supposed to do. I mean, if you're going to do things like that with apps, what you want to do is make sure you embed them in practice. So the app itself might not be brilliant, but with good practice. So it could be, you know, giving them some really good reflection prompts or things to do alongside the app, writing about what why their best score was the best, what was their best move, what did you learn, you know, where else do you use this maths? Those types of prompts are really valuable.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Any other questions? We've got -1 minute. Okay. Yes, engagingmaths.com is my website, someone asked. So. Okay.
Hello, Catherine.
Yes, Matt.
Yeah, sorry. Apologies if you may have covered this before. I joined a little bit late. Just got a question more towards the other end, sort of senior school.
Yep.
I was just wondering if you share some thoughts on the merit of using applications such as either Microsoft Excel or R or either MATLAB or Scilab or something like that from a more creative point of view, and the advantage they have of being able to deal with big lots of data. So, for example, in statistics, rather than pen and paper, you can only cope with a dozen sort of data points. You can use that volume of data. Just interested in your thoughts of the relative trade-off between the time required to learn bits of those applications, to the value to get out of it, to the creative aspect, and the sort of cross-curricular benefits. Do you think some of those things are worth it?
Look, I think so, but I'm not sure how long some of those programs would take in terms of training kids to use them. So, and that's definitely something that you have to take into account, particularly in senior secondary, when you often it's a really tight timetable to get the curriculum covered. But I think if you can do it.
I was thinking in terms of simple, not learning the whole app, but things like graphing, for example, which has applications in to bit of data, whack up a quick plot that has relevance to say science or HASS or something like that.
Yes, most definitely. I would definitely be supporting that. It's reflective of what goes on in the real world anyway, right? When these kids are going to leave school, if they're going to be using mathematics, for example, and particularly around statistics, there's such a need for people with statistics backgrounds at the moment. If you could introduce kids to that at an early stage, brilliant. So I would definitely promote that, especially if it's cross-curricular as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll probably need to wind it up. I certainly have another Zoom to go to, and I'm sure you're pretty busy too, Catherine. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate you giving us your time. I know how busy you are, and and look, you're even getting claps.
Thanks, everyone. Definitely. I'm sorry it was so rushed, but I really wanted to kind of give you a good picture of the pyramid. And look, if you weren't here in person, I'd give you one each, because we made quite a few of them. But you'd have to come to Sydney to get one.
Well, we're not allowed to do that.
I know. I'll give you one, Lorraine, next time I see you.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Okay, thanks, Catherine.
Bye, everyone.